Most people have never heard their own mind clearly, not once, because silence terrifies them. The moment quiet enters the room, they reach for stimulation instinctively. The phone, the music, the scrolling, the notifications. The endless stream of other people's opinions flooding their nervous system from morning until sleep. And after enough years, something disturbing happens. You stop knowing which thoughts are actually yours. Your desires become borrowed. Your beliefs become downloaded. Your personality becomes assembled from fragments of external influence. A little from social media, a little from trends, a little from fear of exclusion, a little from algorithms carefully engineered to keep your attention emotionally dependent. And slowly, the modern human being becomes psychologically crowded, never alone internally, never fully clear, always reacting, always consuming, always adjusting identity unconsciously to match external noise. This is the approval trap, not simply wanting validation, but becoming neurologically addicted to feedback itself. The brain now expects constant external confirmation before trusting its own instincts. Post something, wait for reactions, share an opinion, check responses, express emotion, measure engagement. Modern technology transformed human insecurity into an economic system. Your attention became currency. Your self-worth became measurable. And the terrifying part is this: most people no longer realize they are trapped inside this loop. Because the prison feels normal. Everyone is reachable constantly now. Everyone available constantly. Everyone connected constantly. But connection without boundaries slowly destroys psychological depth. A mind interrupted every few minutes cannot develop original thought. It can only recycle fragments. The nervous system never descends deeply enough into stillness to discover what exists beneath the noise. So people become informationally overloaded, but internally hollow, endlessly stimulated, rarely transformed. And there is a hidden tax attached to this perpetual reachability. A tax paid through attention, focus, identity. Every notification steals a fragment of cognitive sovereignty. Every interruption pulls your nervous system outward again, until eventually your mind no longer belongs fully to you. It belongs partially to everyone demanding access simultaneously. Friends, work, algorithms, news cycles, group chats, cultural outrage, digital performance. Infinite psychological invasion disguised as connection. And because humans adapt gradually, most people never notice how fragmented they became. They only feel the symptoms: mental fatigue, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, emotional numbness, the strange inability to sit quietly without craving stimulation. Because silence now feels unfamiliar, almost threatening. Why? Because silence removes distraction. And distraction was protecting you from yourself. Without noise, buried thoughts begin surfacing. Questions appear, contradictions appear, loneliness appears, fear appears. So people run back towards stimulation immediately. More scrolling, more content, more opinions, more noise. Anything to avoid direct confrontation with their own internal landscape. But eventually, you must ask yourself something uncomfortable. Who would you become if the world stopped speaking for a while, not forever? Just long enough for your own voice to emerge beneath the static. Because perhaps the greatest threat to personal sovereignty today is not physical oppression, it is psychological overcrowding. Too many voices entering your mind constantly. Too many influences shaping your desires invisibly. Too much access granted to people and systems that never earned intimacy with your consciousness. And maybe that is why so many people secretly fantasize about disappearing sometimes. Not dying, disappearing, turning everything off, leaving the noise behind, becoming unreachable for a while. Because deep down, some ancient part of the human spirit still remembers something modern life forgot. A soul cannot hear itself think inside permanent chaos. And this is where strategic isolation begins, not from hatred of the world, not from weakness, but from the realization that constant exposure slowly erodes the architecture of the self. You cannot build an authentic identity while drowning in uninterrupted influence. You cannot hear your instincts clearly while the crowd is screaming continuously. And you cannot govern your own mind while allowing unlimited external access to your attention. So eventually, the strongest thing a person can do is step back, close the gates, reduce the noise, and begin the terrifying process of meeting themselves without distraction for the very first time. The architecture of intentional solitude. Most people think isolation is what happens when life goes wrong. A punishment, a social failure, an emotional collapse. But there is another form of isolation entirely. Chosen isolation. Intentional solitude, not escapism, strategy. A deliberate withdrawal from noise so the mind can reorganize itself without interference. Because clarity rarely arrives inside crowded environments. It arrives in silence, in distance, in moments where external voices finally lose their grip on your nervous system. This is why every civilization once respected solitude deeply. Monks disappeared into mountains. Philosophers walked alone for hours. Warriors isolated themselves before battle. Writers vanished from society to think clearly. They understood something modern culture forgot. A human being needs periods of protected mental space to remain psychologically whole. Without that space, the mind becomes reactive instead of reflective. You stop choosing your direction consciously and start drifting according to whatever influence reaches you loudest. That is why strategic isolation is not loneliness. Loneliness is emotional starvation. Strategic isolation is psychological nutrition. One weakens identity, the other rebuilds it, but rebuilding requires structure. An inner fortress cannot exist without boundaries, and boundaries are becoming increasingly rare in modern life. People now allow unrestricted access to their attention. Anyone can interrupt them instantly. Any platform can invade their thoughts instantly. Any trend can hijack their emotions instantly. There are no gates anymore, only permanent exposure. And exposure without filtration creates psychological erosion. So the first step in building an inner fortress is simple: reduce access. Not because people are evil, because attention is sacred. And whatever constantly enters your awareness eventually shapes your inner world. Protecting that inner world becomes essential. This means creating non-negotiable spaces where the external world cannot reach you continuously. Hours without devices, moments without notifications, entire evenings without digital performance, silence without explanation, privacy without guilt. At first, this feels uncomfortable, almost unnatural, because your nervous system became addicted to stimulation gradually. The brain expects interruption now, expects novelty, expects external input constantly. So when silence arrives, withdrawal symptoms appear psychologically. Restlessness, anxiety, the compulsive urge to check something, anything. But stay there, do not run immediately. Because beneath that discomfort exists something valuable, your actual mind. Not the distracted one, not the performative one. The untouched one waiting beneath layers of external noise. And eventually something fascinating begins happening. Your thoughts slow down, your emotions become clearer, your attention deepens. You begin noticing which desires genuinely belong to you and which were implanted through repetition and social pressure. This is where the dismantling begins. The dismantling of the external ego, the version of yourself assembled for observation, the personality optimized for approval, the identity built through mirrors instead of self-awareness. Isolation exposes how much of your behavior was performative. Without an audience, many habits suddenly lose meaning. Many opinions lose certainty. Many ambitions lose emotional intensity. And this can feel deeply disorienting initially, because the ego survives through external reinforcement. Without constant reaction, it weakens. But that weakening is necessary, because beneath the external ego exists something quieter and far more durable, your authentic core. Not authentic in the romanticized sense. Not some perfected hidden self waiting dramatically inside you. Authentic simply means the part of you that remains when performance stops. the desires that survive without applause, the values that exist without reward, the thoughts that emerge when nobody is shaping your perception. Most people rarely meet this part of themselves. They are too connected, too reachable, too externally entangled. So they continue living through reflex instead of awareness. Strategic isolation interrupts this cycle. It transforms solitude into a psychological laboratory, a place where identity can reorganize honestly, not according to trends, not according to algorithms, not according to social expectation, but according to direct confrontation with reality. And reality inside solitude is brutally honest. You begin noticing how much noise was drowning your instincts, how much performance was draining your spirit, how much unnecessary access people had to your emotional state. This realization changes your relationship with availability completely. You stop treating constant access as virtue. You stop apologizing for needing silence. You stop believing every message deserves immediate response, because you finally understand something essential. A fortress with permanently open gates is not a fortress. It is occupied territory. And perhaps the greatest act of self-respect in the modern world is learning how to become psychologically unavailable to unnecessary chaos. Not cold, not disconnected, just sovereign, able to enter silence without panic, able to protect your attention without guilt, able to exist without constant external confirmation. That is the architecture of intentional solitude. Not hiding from life, but finally building a mind strong enough to face it without becoming consumed by its noise. Confronting the shadows in the silence. Silence feels peaceful in theory, but in reality, silence is often where people meet the parts of themselves they spent years avoiding. That is why many people cannot stay alone for long. Not because solitude itself hurts, because distraction was functioning like anesthesia. The noise protected them. Constant stimulation kept deeper questions buried. But once the world becomes quiet, the mind begins opening hidden rooms. Old memories surface, unresolved shame surfaces, contradictions surface, regret surfaces, and perhaps most painfully, the realization of how disconnected you became from yourself. This is the first encounter with the shadows, not monsters, not evil, just the neglected fragments of your identity waiting in darkness for acknowledgement. The insecurity you covered with arrogance, the loneliness hidden beneath productivity, the anger disguised as indifference, the fear hidden beneath perfectionism, the grief buried beneath distraction. Modern life makes avoidance incredibly easy. You can scroll endlessly, consume endlessly, work endlessly, talk endlessly, perform endlessly, and never once sit quietly long enough to hear your real emotional condition. But isolation removes escape routes gradually. The silence forces confrontation, and confrontation initially feels brutal, because without external stimulation, your mind loses places to hide. This is why many people abandon solitude quickly. They mistake discomfort for danger, but discomfort is not always destruction. Sometimes it is revelation. Your nervous system is finally detecting unresolved emotional weight it previously drowned in noise. This is what makes solitude a laboratory. Inside silence, patterns become visible. You begin seeing recurring emotional loops clearly, the same fears, the same coping mechanisms, the same self-deceptions repeated endlessly. And perhaps the hardest realization is this: many of the traits you hate in yourself were originally survival strategies. The need for validation, the emotional numbness, the hyper-independence, the people-pleasing, the avoidance, the perfectionism. These behaviors were not random weakness. They were adaptations. Psychological armor developed in response to earlier pain. Understanding this changes the relationship completely. You stop viewing yourself as broken and begin viewing yourself as fragmented. There is a difference. Broken implies hopelessness. Fragmented implies reintegration is possible, and reintegration requires honesty. Radical honesty, not performative self-awareness, not intellectual analysis designed to avoid feeling. Actual confrontation. You must sit with truths that damage your preferred self-image. You must admit motivations that embarrass you. Envy, fear, neediness, resentment, cowardice, control. These traits exist inside nearly every human being. But most people bury them immediately because the ego wants purity. The ego wants coherence. The ego wants to believe, I am good. I am evolved. I am above certain emotions. But the shadow does not disappear simply because it is denied. It moves underground, and hidden traits become dangerous precisely because they remain unconscious. Suppressed anger becomes passive aggression. Suppressed insecurity becomes superiority. Suppressed fear becomes control. Suppressed loneliness becomes addiction. What remains unseen begins governing behavior silently. This is why strategic isolation matters deeply. Without distance from noise, you cannot observe yourself clearly enough to integrate these contradictions consciously. And integration is the real goal, not perfection. Perfection creates fragile people. Integrated people are resilient because they know what exists inside them. They are not shocked by their own darkness anymore. They stop wasting energy pretending to be purely virtuous. And paradoxically, that honesty makes them calmer, safer, more trustworthy. A person aware of their shadows becomes less controlled by them. This creates inner stability, not because conflict disappears, but because self-deception weakens. Inside solitude, you begin auditing your life differently too. You question desires you previously accepted automatically. Do I truly want this career, or was I trained to want status? Do I genuinely enjoy this lifestyle, or am I performing success? Do I actually believe these opinions, or did repetition turn them into identity? These questions are deeply uncomfortable because they threaten the architecture of the external self, but they also create freedom. For the first time, you begin separating authentic desire from inherited expectation, and this separation changes everything. Because many people spend their entire lives chasing goals they never consciously chose. Goals downloaded from family, culture, social media, fear of exclusion, fear of insignificance. Silence exposes this mercilessly. That is why solitude can feel both terrifying and sacred simultaneously. Terrifying because illusion begins collapsing. Sacred because truth finally has room to breathe. And eventually, if you remain inside the silence long enough, something remarkable happens. You stop fearing yourself. The shadows lose their monstrous shape. The contradictions soften. You realize human beings were never meant to be perfectly coherent creatures, only conscious ones. And perhaps that is the true purpose of the inner fortress, not to escape reality, but to create a protected space where you can finally encounter yourself honestly enough to become whole. Forging unshakable internal discernment. Most people do not actually think independently. They react. There is a difference. Reaction is immediate, emotional. Automatic, true discernment is slower, calmer, deliberate, but modern life trains people away from discernment completely. Everything now competes for instant emotional response. Outrage, trends, breaking news, public opinion. Algorithms carefully engineered to trigger urgency before reflection. The world no longer rewards depth. It rewards immediacy. So people begin outsourcing judgment unconsciously. They wait to see what everyone else thinks first, what the internet says, what the crowd approves, what generates social safety. And slowly, their internal compass weakens. Not because they are unintelligent, because constant exposure fragments clarity. A mind flooded with external noise struggles to distinguish signal from static. That is why strategic isolation becomes essential. Distance sharpens perception. Silence restores filtration. And filtration determines identity more than intelligence ever will. Because your life ultimately becomes shaped by what you repeatedly allow into your consciousness. Every idea enters like a seed. Some strengthen you, some distort you, some quietly colonize your thinking without permission. Discernment is the ability to recognize the difference before influence becomes identity. This requires building a personal filtration system consciously, Not every opinion deserves emotional entry. Not every trend deserves attention. Not every crisis deserves your nervous system. The modern world profits from your psychological overstimulation. Fear spreads faster than wisdom. Outrage spreads faster than nuance. Distraction spreads faster than truth. So the undisciplined mind becomes overwhelmed quickly, pulled in every direction simultaneously. One moment angry, one moment anxious, one moment inspired, one moment defeated. Constant emotional volatility caused by unrestricted mental consumption. But the person with discernment moves differently. They pause, observe, evaluate. Not every stimulus receives immediate reaction. Not every external pressure becomes internal chaos. This creates extraordinary psychological stability, especially in unstable environments, because discernment protects sovereignty. Without it, you become programmable, a product of trends, a mirror of your environment, a collection of borrowed convictions constantly shifting with social tides. And perhaps the most dangerous influence today is not obvious propaganda, but subtle repetition. Repeated narratives, repeated fears, repeated ideals of success, repeated emotional conditioning disguised as culture. Humans absorb repetition biologically. The nervous system begins interpreting familiarity as truth. That is why isolation periodically matters. You must step outside the stream long enough to examine what has been entering your mind unnoticed. What beliefs genuinely belong to you? What ambitions emerged organically? What fears were inherited? What values survived without social reinforcement? Very few people ask these questions deeply, because independent thinking sounds romantic, but in practice it feels isolating. The crowd offers comfort, certainty, belonging. Discernment often requires standing psychologically alone for periods of time, especially when your conclusions differ from collective narratives. That is why self-reliance matters, not only financially, mentally, emotionally. A self-reliant mind can tolerate disagreement without collapsing internally, can tolerate uncertainty without panicking, can make decisions without requiring constant consensus from others. This does not mean arrogance or believing you are always correct. True discernment remains humble, curious, adaptable, but it does not surrender judgment automatically to social pressure. And one of the most powerful tools in cultivating discernment is silence itself. Calculated silence, not insecurity, not passivity. Strategic restraint. Most people speak too quickly, share ideas too early, expose fragile thoughts before they fully mature internally. And once exposed, the outside world begins shaping them immediately. Approval distorts them. Criticism distorts them. Expectation distorts them. That is why silence can become protective. Some ideas require incubation. Some transformations require privacy. A seed forced open too early dies before rooting. The same happens psychologically. Not everything meaningful needs immediate exposure. The strongest minds often move quietly initially, observing longer than they speak, thinking deeper than they announce, because they understand something essential. Attention alters development, and in a world addicted to instant broadcasting, patience becomes intellectual power. The ability to sit with uncertainty, to refine thought privately, to resist premature validation. This creates depth most people never develop. Eventually, your relationship with information changes completely. You stop consuming endlessly and start curating consciously. You become selective, protective of mental space, protective of emotional energy, because you finally understand your attention is not infinite, and whatever repeatedly enters consciousness eventually shapes perception itself. That realization changes how you move through the world. You stop needing constant updates, stop chasing every opinion, stop allowing collective panic to dictate your nervous system. Instead, you develop an inner anchor, a quieter center untouched by temporary hysteria. This is what makes someone truly difficult to manipulate, not intelligence alone. Internal stability, the ability to remain psychologically grounded while the external world becomes chaotic. And perhaps that is the hidden purpose of the inner fortress after all, not isolation from reality, but the creation of a mind clear enough to engage with reality without becoming consumed by it, weaponizing your stillness for the real world. Eventually, you must leave the fortress. Return to the noise. Return to people. Return to systems designed to pull your attention outward again. But if solitude was real, you do not return as the same person who entered. Something changes inside people who learn how to sit with themselves honestly. They stop moving with desperation, stop speaking with unconscious urgency, stop chasing approval in every interaction, and others feel this immediately. Calmness has weight, especially in a world addicted to reaction. Most people leak emotional energy constantly, over-explaining, defending themselves, seeking validation, reacting impulsively, trying desperately to manage perception. But the person who cultivated stillness moves differently. They pause before speaking, observe before reacting, listen without immediately preparing performance. This creates presence, and presence is becoming increasingly rare. That rarity gives it power, because chaotic environments reward the individual who remains psychologically composed, while everyone else becomes emotionally flooded. In high-pressure situations, stillness becomes strategic advantage. The calm person sees what panic hides. The quiet person notices what noise conceals. The emotionally grounded person makes decisions others cannot access while trapped inside reaction. This is why strategic isolation was never about escaping reality permanently. It was preparation, training. You withdraw temporarily so you can re-enter the world without becoming psychologically absorbed by it again. And this changes relationships first. People can no longer manipulate you as easily through approval or disapproval. Why? Because solitude taught you how to exist without constant emotional reinforcement. You no longer panic when misunderstood immediately. No longer rush to explain yourself compulsively. No longer shape your identity around keeping everyone comfortable. That creates boundaries naturally. Calm boundaries, not aggressive ones. The strongest people rarely need theatrical displays of strength. Their presence communicates stability already. This also changes communication profoundly. Silence becomes intentional instead of awkward. You stop speaking merely to reduce tension. You become comfortable allowing pauses to exist. Most people fear silence because silence exposes insecurity quickly. But the grounded person uses silence like space in music. Deliberately, powerfully, a calm pause often reveals more than endless words ever could. Especially in negotiation, conflict, leadership. Human beings unconsciously trust emotional stability, not because stability guarantees correctness, but because composure signals internal order. And internal order is magnetic in chaotic environments. This is why stillness influences others naturally, not through domination, through contrast. The reactive world eventually notices the person who remains centered while everyone else becomes fragmented. But there is another important shift too. You stop absorbing every emotional atmosphere around you. Most people live with psychologically open borders. Any mood enters them. Any trend affects them. Any conflict destabilizes them. Strategic isolation changes this. You develop an inner anchor strong enough to remain separate from collective emotional turbulence. Not disconnected, disciplined. This matters enormously now, because modern environments constantly weaponize emotional contagion. Fear spreads rapidly. Outrage spreads rapidly. Panic spreads rapidly. And people without internal grounding become absorbed into every wave unconsciously. But the person with an inner fortress can engage reality without drowning inside it, can observe chaos without becoming chaos internally. That ability creates immense strategic clarity, especially in volatile times. Because when systems become unstable emotionally, reactive people make catastrophic decisions. The grounded person becomes rare and valuable, not because they know everything, because they can think clearly while others cannot. This applies creatively too. Stillness sharpens perception. You begin seeing patterns others overlook, opportunities others miss, contradictions others ignore. Why? Because your attention is no longer fragmented constantly. Your mind regained depth, and depth changes how you engage the world entirely. Even ambition transforms. You stop chasing outcomes from insecurity, stop building from emotional hunger. Your actions become cleaner, more precise, less desperate. Ironically, this often makes you more effective than before, because desperation clouds judgment, but groundedness sharpens it. And perhaps the most powerful transformation is this: you stop needing the world to become peaceful before finding peace internally. That dependence disappears. The outer world remains chaotic. Politics, economics, algorithms, social pressure, uncertainty, all still exist. But your stability no longer depends entirely on external conditions. The fortress remains inside you, a psychological anchor, a protected inner territory the world cannot fully invade anymore. This does not mean life becomes easy or pain disappears. It means your center stops collapsing every time reality becomes unstable. That is true resilience, not emotional numbness, emotional sovereignty. The ability to remain internally rooted while everything external shifts unpredictably. And perhaps this is the final lesson strategic isolation teaches. The goal was never to abandon humanity. The goal was to stop abandoning yourself every time the crowd demanded it. Because once you reclaim ownership of your own mind, the world loses much of its power to control your spirit. And from that place of stillness, you finally become capable of entering chaos without carrying chaos back home inside you. If this video resonated with you, then somewhere deep inside, you are probably exhausted from noise. Not just sound, psychological noise, other people's opinions, other people's expectations, other people's fears slowly becoming your own. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you are beginning to realize how much of your life has been shaped by constant exposure instead of conscious choice. That realization matters, because most people never stop long enough to hear themselves beneath the chaos. They spend their entire lives reacting, scrolling, consuming, performing, until one day they wake up feeling psychologically crowded by voices that were never truly theirs. But you still have a choice. You can keep living with permanently open gates, or you can begin protecting your mind like something sacred. Build boundaries, protect your attention. Learn how to sit in silence without escaping yourself immediately. Because the strongest minds are not built in endless stimulation. They are built in stillness, in reflection, in moments where the world finally becomes quiet enough for truth to emerge. And no, strategic isolation is not about hating people. It is about refusing to lose yourself inside collective noise. It is about becoming sovereign again, clear enough to think independently, calm enough to resist emotional manipulation, grounded enough to exist without needing constant validation from strangers. That kind of inner stability is becoming rare now, and rare things become powerful. So if these ideas resonated with you, if some part of you feels emotionally drained from being constantly reachable, constantly stimulated, constantly influenced, subscribe to the channel. Not for empty motivation, but for ideas that help you reclaim ownership over your own mind in a world fighting for your attention every second. And share this video with someone who feels lost inside modern noise, someone quietly overwhelmed, someone who forgot what their own inner voice even sounds like anymore. Because sometimes the first step toward freedom is finally becoming silent long enough to hear yourself again.